Okay, welcome. In this tutorial, we are going to be looking at how to add displacement to an object using Redshift. And displacement is basically using a height map or some procedurally generated texture as a way to actually move the surface of the mesh. We actually push it in and pull it out a little bit. And it takes a little bit of setup to get there. We're also going to be looking at how to use Vertex map to control where this gets applied to. In the previous tutorials, we looked at using curvature that allows you to only apply an effect, say, on areas where there's more curvature, whether that's convex or concave. In this series, we'll look at displacement in general, and then we're going to look at how to be very specific in terms of where you want this certain texture to be applied. Okay, so let's get started. So first, we're going to create two cubes. So I just have two cubes. They're exactly the same. I'm going to scoot one over. I currently have my display set to guard shading lines so you can see the differences. And the only other difference we're going to do is one of these cubes, it doesn't matter which one, we're going to have 20 segments on each, oops, not 2020, but 20 segments on each side. I don't know why tab is deciding not to work, but there we go. Okay. So we have one that's like really basic and one that has a lot more information on it. And that first one, let's actually switch that. Instead of 1, let's do 4. I'm remembering why we want to do this here in a second. Okay, so we've got these two cubes. Now, the next step we want to do is we want to, one, make sure that we are actually using the Redshift renderer, so I am. And then we're going to open up our material manager. If there's not a material in there already, which I restarted this tutorial, so that's why that's there. But if not, just hit the plus sign, create like a basic default material, and we're just going to apply it to both objects. Now, once we've done that, before we get into the render engine or anything at all, we're going to add one light to the scene, and we're going to do an area light. And so I've created the area light. I'm just going to pull, I'm not going to, I mean, you can adjust that if you want, but I'm going to move this up, and I'm just going to position it so it's kind of looking down at the surface of these cubes, but at an angle. It doesn't matter the number of degrees, but when you're working with displacement, being able to see like reasonably crisp shadows and intensity is important to be able to see if this is actually being applied in the way that you think it is. So I've got it set somewhat at an angle here to these. It's probably far too close, and everything's going to be blasted out. But once we once we bring up Redshift, we'll make adjustments to the intensity of the light. I'm not too worried about that right now. Okay, so we've got the scene set up. We could put a ground plane into or something else, but we don't really need anything else to get going. So now let's go ahead and open up our material. So you may have already noticed that there's this displacement channel on our output, right? And it's got this like purple indicator. In some cases, right, I can actually send the color information into one of these white ones, or right, a white one into a yellow, and it works fine. However, in this case, if I was to just try and send like color or a texture directly into this displacement, it's going to turn the whole material red. And that's Redshift's way of telling you something is terribly wrong. And so what we need to do is we need a node that will allow us to make the conversion from whatever we're going to be using into a displacement. So I'm going to go ahead and double click. And I am going to just search for DISP. Right, and that creates 3 options: a bump map, displacement, and displacement blender. We're not going to worry about blending displacements right now, but we are going to worry about our displacement channel. Now, if you want to there's a difference between bump and displacement, and maybe we should create both of these real quick so we can talk about that. But so I've got my displacement. I'm going to go ahead and double click again, type in DSP, and create a bump map. I want you to note that bump maps and displacements both have purple outputs, and the bump map over here has a purple input. But bump maps, right, what bump does versus what displacement does is bump fakes texture on the surface, right? And in some cases that is perfectly fine. it works really well, and it's significantly faster than displacing the geometry and rendering that. Now, the differences are that a bump map, when you do it, you'll have you'll see all this texture on the surface, but then when you get to an edge, the edge is still going to be perfectly straight and clean, right? Whereas displacement is actually going to bend and warp and change the edge as well based on the texture that you've applied. So that's one of the things. And there's other times when, depending on the angle and things and how close you are to it, sometimes something in the bump channel doesn't quite look right. It looks odd or fake or off, and that's when displacement is most useful. And also displacement can manipulate the mesh in a more significant way as well. And so you can get much more accurate lighting and shadows. And if you're interested in using subsurface scattering and you want all that displacement texture to be somewhat translucent, you need to do it with displacement and not the bump map. Right? But otherwise, they're very similar, and we can even use the same exact textures to make these changes. And they're so similar that when you use displacement, by default, depending on how far away from the camera you are and some other settings, it will automatically switch between displacement and a bump map. So, right, if it's further from the screen, it's going to be more efficient and optimized by using a bump map rather than the displacement, right? So displacement, again, if you're making an object that's a long way away, off in the distance, you can just use a bump map. And we're going to focus on displacement, but basically these two things work almost identically. So you don't need to, you could do all the same steps with a bump map. But I just want you to know that both are options. So we're going to delete the bump map for now. We're going to focus on displacement. Okay, so with displacement, you'll note there's no inputs yet, right? But there is this text map option here. And something I haven't talked about in other tutorials yet is there's all these circles here next to each one of these settings. That basically means this is something that we can take and create an input for. And right, in this case, if I click on this dot, it's going to say connect node, right? And there's existing nodes, there's environment, legacy, texture, right? I can go in and basically I can use this to create a node and connect it in one step. Now, there's also textures, right? But there's no reference textures in the scene. I can load a texture this way. There's a lot of different ways I can get a texture in here. I'm going to go to connect node, and since I don't have an existing texture node, I'm going to go down to texture. I'm going to go down to texture again, and I'm going to click. And you'll see that what that does is it creates this, it dropped it right on top of the other, but it creates a texture node and it's already connected. Super fast and easy to do. That's great. So for this texture, we're going to be doing scratches again because scratches are nice. We all like getting, having our itches scratched. And again, because it's just so useful and everybody has the same thing, we're going to go ahead and go to the asset browser. I'm going to type in scratch. Unless I spell it completely wrong, in which case I will redo this again. Yeah, scratch. There we go. And then really any of these materials will work. I think I'm going to go with this one over here. Hopefully you can all see that. I'm going to zoom in a bit so we can see the whole title, maybe, if we're lucky. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit further. Which one was I going to do? This one right here would be actually perfect. It's puck scratches. And so I'm going to go ahead, and once I have that selected, I'm going to drop this down in my path. Now that I've got that set in my path, it's plugged into my displacement. And now what I want to do is I just want to go ahead and connect this displacement to here. Now let's go ahead and see what happens in our render view. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my Redshift tab, or right, you can always go up and you can just go to Redshift, go down to render view to pop that up, or it's also available under the render settings here, and it's actually the top setting for me. So if I go ahead and hit, if I get this, the IPR rolling, you'll see that nothing is happening. right? I want to make sure I have the material on the objects. I do, but for some reason, none of that displacement is showing up. Now, the reason that none of that displacement is showing up is because in order for displacement is expensive. And so Redshift basically requires you to say, hey, I want to put displacement on this object. So you have to manually tell it, I want to do this. And the way that you do that is you need to add a tag. Specifically, you need the Redshift object tag. Now, we've used this before in other tutorials to add a subdivision surface and make that function. So I'm going to click on that tag there. I'm going to right click again on my other cube. I'm going to add the same tag. It's under render tags and RS object. Now that I've done that, I want to make sure I go to the geometry tab in my thing, and I want to check mark override. I need to check mark override or enable the tessellation, and you'll note that already I'm getting rounding on this object. And then if I go down a little further, you'll see there's displacement. I need to make sure I have displacement enabled. As soon as I do that, you're going to see a significant change to this first object. That's pretty exciting. Let's go ahead and do it to the other cube as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click on here. Fortunately, it automatically keeps me in the geometry tag. Unless if it's moved to a different one, just make sure you switch back. I'm going to check this, and check this. Now, I could have selected both of these tags and done this at the exact same time, but in this case, I wanted to do them independently just to give you two options. Okay, so now we have displacement working. Wasn't that easy? It's pretty it's remarkable. And you can see what I mean, this edge here, right, actually has the shadow is varied. And if I go ahead and zoom in a little bit, right, so you can see now that, right, I've got a substantial amount of texture, and this actually looks like, it looks like skin. It looks like zoomed in skin. It's kind of gross, but that's just something to note, right? So I've got these scratches on here, and they're actually pressing into the surface of the object. Now, there are some settings that we can adjust to change the behavior of these scratches. So the first thing I can do is if I go ahead and open up my material manager and double click to open my nodes up, let's look at what this displacement operator allows us to do. The first is we have several settings. I have found that in general, you want to use the height field as the map encoding that you're working with, and generally you want to use object as the space. If I click tangent, right, we're going to see that it makes a subtle change, but it's not that great. And you really are supposed to be defining tangent channels, and we're not going to worry about that today. This is kind of the introduction. Okay, so the other settings we can do is scale, and then there's this old minimum range, old max, new min, new max, right, which basically is adjusting the grayscale range from 0 to 1 of the input image and how that should be changed for the output. So let's first let's go ahead and boost our scale. Let's crank this up to 2. I want you to note that we might have had a slight change there, but it's not really very substantial. I'm going to go ahead and set this to 5. And you're going to note that nothing has really changed, right? It seems like it's maxed out. And that's because it has. If I go ahead and, let's see here, cube, this is the cube that's in the foreground, I think. Yeah. So if I go ahead and select this cube and this tag on the cube, and we are in our geometry tab, if we go down to displacement, notice that there's this maximum displacement value, right? That's saying this is as displaced as it's going to be, and it's currently set to 1. So if I was to actually set this to 5, right, now I've got a lot more displacement happening, right? And it the whole thing breaks down because I have my scale set to 5. Right? Or I have my maximum displacement set to 5, right? So it's actually making this whole cube larger, right? Because it's pushing all of these points further out from the surface. So now if I was to set this to 2, right, I should have something that Again, I actually have a lot more texture, and you'll note that at 2, I'm actually getting a substantial amount more noise and everything on here. And so, right, in some cases it works really well. In this case, it's like, it's hideous, to be honest. Like, this is not the look that we want. But it's just something to note that you want to, like, say I wanted like a little bit more height, right? Maybe I set this maximum displacement to 2. And then, right, now it's even and I'm still at the same point, but now I could say, oh, I want this to be like 1.2 or something like that as my scale. And so I've got a little bit more depth and a little bit more texture than I did before, but it's not so crazy that it's kind of breaking everything and making it look totally insane. You'll note that there is this enable auto bump mapping option, and that means that like this object in the background is most likely being bump mapped. And the way I know that is, right, in this foreground object I can see like little nicks and things here, but if I look at this other edge, it's really smooth, right? And that edge there is also very smooth. There's some aliasing, but in the end, it's a really smooth object. And so it's doing this transition as it goes further away from the camera to do the bump mapping, so it's not as expensive. Let's see here, what else? So there's also the displacement scale. If I increase the displacement scale, you'll see that it changes the outcome some, right? But it's still kind of being maxed out a little bit. So if I was to jump this up to 44, right, we're going to get a much different result, right? This is actually totally kind of crazy and cool looking, but not really what we want to do, right? Again, these are things you can play with to kind of see how they react. Generally, you know, you don't want anything this insane on any of your objects. You usually want things to remain somewhere in that range of 1. It really, again, depends on what you're working on. Let's look at what happens with other textures, right? We're dealing with scratches right now, but let's go ahead and create a different type of texture. Let's go ahead and do tiles. So we're going to do tiles. I'm going to double click on that, and I'm just going to swap this out. And once I've swapped that out, right, we're going to get, right, a tiled texture on our object. This is pretty great. Something to note with tiles, right? If there's, say you're trying to make like, I don't know, like a cap or something that has like edges, that has like a bunch of ridges on it that are repeating, or I'm actually looking at a power strip right now that has these like repeating edges on the face in different areas. I can use tiles to do that. If I select the tiles and I'm in my node editor and I go and change the pattern. If you haven't done this before, I can say lines or lines 2. I don't remember which ones. I think lines is a little simpler. You can see right now I've got these lines, and I can do a lot of things like, say, shrink that grout width all the way down to 0 and shrink my bevel width all the way down to 0. And now I've got, right, much cleaner looking lines. I can adjust my colors as well, right? So we've got like really the two colors we can see are this red and gray. They're pretty close in color. So we're not going to get a whole lot of variation. But if I was to say make one of these white, 100%, and one of these 100% black, you're going to see that I am getting, right, a substantially larger amount of variation. Now, there's also some problems here, right? We can see all this crazy artifacting on the edges. And that's because, right, we're adding geometry to this cube, but there's a limit on how much more geometry is being added. And the more geometry we add, the more expensive and longer this takes to render. So if I was to go to my cube over here, cube 1, to this tag, go to my geometry, you'll see that, right, I've got my minimum edge length here set to 4 and my max subdivision set to 6. If I was to boost, I don't know if this fixes it. No, that's not going to fix it. If I boost this to 7 or 8, it's going to clean up some of those edges a little bit, but I'm still going to have some of those problems. And so bringing back a little bit of my bevel width So if I was to say, oh, let's make this like 0.01, right? Even that tiny bit of bevel is going to help clean these edges up substantially. And it's something where I might want to boost it just a little bit more, like 0.05 or even 0.1. It really depends on the object and how tiny that scale is that you're working at. But right, that really cleans those edges up a ton. So let's look at, now that we've got something a little different, let's look at what happens when we increase our maximum displacement and our displacement scale. So if I set this to 87, there's still some errors in there. Maybe the grout width needs to be like 0.012, so we get just like a, nope, still having some strange behavior there. And I don't know if we can make our minimum edge length smaller and clean that up. It looks like that's helping a little bit. Not really so much. It's taking forever to render, but it is slowly getting rid of these artifacts, right? So in this case, right, we probably don't want this maximum displacement set to 87. I was going to say something more like 5. And let's see if that, right, that's going to get rid of that. But then if I make my displacement scale here, let's say 5 as well. Let's see if we get, right, now we've got, right, substantially larger deviations in that surface. Right, so this is a really handy tool for doing details like this that you could do just with geometry. You could do it with the tools and do it in geometry, or you can do it with the displacement. Right, and now if you're exporting something to another piece of software, this might be problematic, but there are ways to bake this into a texture into normal maps. So if you're doing something for video game design, you could always get some of this texture. But if you're trying to do really big stuff, you would definitely want to do that with geometry, if at all possible, if you're exporting it to something where it needs to be more performant. But if you're doing it for work in cinema, this is a great way to go forward. Okay, so that is displacement. So how do we control where displacement impacts the surface? Like, let's say let's go back to our other texture. It might be kind of intensely textured at this point, and so we're going to have to make some adjustments once this goes. Let's see. It's not so bad, but it is pretty intense. Let's set these back to 1 so that we are in a good spot and it's just not too intense. Okay. So let's say that we just want to have scratches on, right? If we just wanted it on all the corners, we could use curvature and we could dial in those settings and just have the scratches on all the corners. But let's say we just want them on the top corners, right? Or we want them in really kind of random places around the surface of this object. The way that we can do that is we can use something called a vertex map. And what a vertex map does is it basically allows you to paint on the vertices of your object so that you can tell it where you want something to have an impact. And vertex maps can be used in all sorts of different ways to modify geometry, to change where clones are located. There's just kind of a really deep way that works. So let's go ahead and look at how to apply a vertex map really quickly. So I'm going to close the node. I'm going to go back to my standard view because I don't need that to be rendering right now. I just need to be able to see this. And we're going to start with the cube 1. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click. I'm going to go to other tags. And under other tags, the very last option is vertex map. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. As soon as I do that, this cube turns bright red. That's a good sign. That means that we are in Vertex, that we have a vertex map in place and ready to use. If I go to this other cube, I'm going to right click, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do this one as well. So we go to other and go to vertex map. That one's red. Now note, if I have the vertex map selected, it's going to make the object red. It's only letting me have one vertex map selected at a time. And I also want you to note that with this vertex map, there's this paintbrush tool, the paint tool. And if I select the paint tool, you'll see it's in painting mode, visible only, blah, 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 all these different settings. Under options, under the options tab for this tool, you'll see that paint mode is currently in vertex map mode. Right? I can also say vertex color, there's some other things you can do, but we're just in vertex map, and that's what we're really going to be focusing on. So if I want there to be, this to be influential, to have scratches on these top corners, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag down this edge. So when I started this, I clicked, and I'm getting this like nothing's happening here, right? When I opened this up, I was on fields mode, or I had fields came up first, and there's this option that says use fields. I want to uncheck use fields. If yours may not be checked, it was the last thing that I did was use fields, because I'm going to show you what happens when we use fields in part of this tutorial. And so I've unchecked that. Make sure that setting is unchecked on my vertex map. Then I can go ahead and click and drag, and it is still not happy. So why is this still unhappy? I believe the question is answered by this being a primitive. So let's go ahead and see what happens if we hit the letter C. So if I hit the letter C, I'm going to select the vertex map again. I'm going to click and drag, and magically, now I can draw on these edges, right? So I can come in here and I can do this. Now I want you to note it's kind of strange, right? The way that this applies, but what it's doing is it's saying any vertex I select, it's going to do a gradient from that vertex to the other vertices around it. And you'll note there's a little bit of an edge that kind of is brighter from, diagonal point to point. But otherwise, right, I'm getting this fade across to these other edges and vertices, right? So it means that this effect is not going to be uniform. It's not this whole, it's not like this face is going to be textured and then this one is not. It's going to be a blend from one to the other. And currently I have, I have my brush set to a specific size, right? It's, if I go to painting, the size is here, the step, there's hardness and fall off and all of that. If I reduce my hardness down some, I should, maybe have like a slightly different effect on there. If I increase the size substantially, I'm going to have like a much larger impact, right? So I have this set to 52, which seems to be enough to like do a reasonably good amount of this edge. And you'll see I'm doing a little bit of, I have a few mistakes here. If I go ahead and hold down Control and click and drag over here, I can basically erase those settings, and then I'm going to actually make my brush a little bit smaller. There we go. And I'm just going to continue down here. And I'm going to do like kind of a rough job. Honestly, we probably wouldn't want this to be super uniform anyway, because, we want this to look natural. And though scratches will be somewhat uniform, they're not going to be completely uniform. Okay, so I've got this vertex map set. Let's go ahead and then we're going to do the same thing with this other object. I'm going to go ahead and make my cube editable. Oops. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm going to make my cube editable. I'm going to select my vertex tag and I'm going to click and drag. Oop. And I'm going to uncheck use fields. And then I'm going to go ahead and click and drag. And I want you to note, I have a lot with the thing with vertex maps is you need the amount of geometry you have is going to determine essentially the resolution with which you can use the tool. So, so because I have fewer vertices, I'm going to have basically I'm going to not be able to have as fine-tuned control over the surface. But I am going to get a really nice gradient across here. And I'm just doing these front two edges on this one just to set this up. Okay. So let's go ahead and open up our material manager, because one of the things we're going to need to do now is we only can apply one vertex map. Well, we could potentially apply two vertex maps to the same object, but it doesn't really work very well. And it's ideally they're attached to the actual geometry they were made on. So we're going to duplicate this material. So I'm just going to select my material. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to paste it. And I'm going to say this one, I'm going to rename this like dense in terms of the number of polygons, and this one will be light. I don't know. And so with the let's go ahead and select our dense material first. I'm going to make sure I have that cube selected here and the vertex map on there turned on. I'm going to double click dense so I can open this up. So now what I need to do is I need to be able to access that vertex map in my material. I need some way to reference it so it knows to use it. So what I do is I double click. I'm going to search for vert, and you'll see there the very top option that comes up is vertex attribute. So I'm going to double click, and I'm going to create this vertex attribute. Now it's going to be this gorgeous magenta color, and what it's going to do is it's going to have this one field that says attribute name. And what we're going to do with that attribute name is we are going to select this node so it shows up in our attributes manager. And then I'm just going to grab this vertex map tag that's on this correct object, and I'm going to drag this down and drop it into that field. So now my vertex map has a reference. It's similar to how we reference a texture. It's basically the same thing. And so if I was to just apply this vertex map to my displacement, so if I go ahead and delete this connector and run this, oops, let's add new output, no. Let's go ahead and undo that. Let's go ahead and swap this way. I guess deleting that was problematic. Okay, so I've connected that there. Let's just see what this looks like in the render engine, and I'm gonna go ahead and hit play on this. And you'll see that nothing really has changed, right? It doesn't look any different whatsoever. So I need to do one more step in order to get this to be usable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come back over to my material manager, double click on dense, and I am going to need to basically blend these two things together. Let's do a color layer. And what we're going to do is we're going to use our, much like we used the curvature, we're going to use this as our mask, but we're going to say out scalar instead of out color. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's mask layer 1 with this. And then the layer 1 color is going to be the texture we want to apply. And once we've done those two things, we want to make sure our base color is black. And let's see if that is functional at all. Not quite yet. Okay. And then at this point, nothing is happening, right? We are getting no change whatsoever. And that's because, right, we still actually have our displacement not connected to the output of this. So let's go ahead and connect this over to here, and let's see what we get. Okay, so I've got all of this set up, and my material is not changing. Now, the reason my material is not changing is because I have neglected to update the material for this, right? I believe that if I go to my cube and select this tag, yes, it is on light, it is not on dense. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that material off of there. I'm going to drag my dense and drop it on the correct cube once I get things out of the way so I can actually do that. So let's go ahead and drop dense on there. Okay. So I've got dense set. So now, right, there's nothing happening here whatsoever. So let's go ahead and look at, I'm going to say normal, and look at how we have this set up. There we go. So I had been switching things because I didn't realize that my object was selected. Okay, so I've got this set up. So I want you to note that now, right, we only have this scratches texture in the area where our map tells us that we can do it. Now, I've set it up, the vertex map, so it's 100% intense on there, right? When I painted it, this yellow equates to 100% intensity, right? And red is 0% intensity. So you can kind of see it as black and white, except it's red and yellow. So in my case, this is like a really intense change between these two things. Now, I could go in and I could soften this. I could use the paintbrush to manipulate and modify that surface. I don't necessarily want to do that while I'm rendering at the same time. So let's look at what happens with the if we do the other texture, right? So this just allows us to have these two settings. We could always go in here and adjust our, where is it? We could always change and test different modes. We could say add and see how that works. It may just be emptiness and it may be smooth all the way across. We'll find out here in just a second. So add actually softens that transition a little bit more than multiply does. It looks like it is in the process of updating. You could, again, you can adjust, you can test all of these different blend modes and see how it works. If we want to do the opposite of what we currently have, right? If we wanted, say we want all the scratches to be in the red and not in the yellow area, but it's a lot easier to color it this way. With your tag here, you can always invert the tag here. So if I switch that, so we've got this set. You can see we can get that varied look, whichever direction we want that to go. We can also use this as a way to mask things for color as well, and say metalness and everything else. So if I was to uncheck invert real quick, and then I was to go ahead and create another color layer up here somewhere in space, and I was to zoom out a little bit so I can see this and take my out scaler and use it the mask for layer 1 again. And then I have my, let's say I have my base color is black, and my, does that make sense? Let's think. Yeah, and my overlay color is going to be white. So what we're going to do is if I select layer 1 and change this to white, right? If I was to then use the solo mode to look at this, right? That's basically what we're going to see. We've got white on the edges, black on the corners. That's exactly what we want. And then now we could set this to our metalness value over here. So I'm going to come over and say metalness. And, oh, and then I'm going to undo solo mode so that this will update. Right, and so now, right, you can, I've got it set so it looks like it's metallic on the edges and it's this gray material on the planes. So if I was to then, I could also do this to set my base color, right? So you can start to see that this can be very quickly a pretty complex and useful tool to do really complex things without needing to UV unwrap anything at all. So I'm going to go ahead and do basically the same thing here, except this is going to control the base color. So let's say where, in this case, where it is metallic, I want that color to be white, because that's going to make it kind of the, I could make it, let's make it a little yellow so it's kind of goldish. And then where everywhere else, let's just make it red. And then let's go ahead and say we're taking this color out. We're going to drop it in our base. And let's see what happens to our image once it figures out what it's doing. Okay, so you can see now we've got this really gaudy, ugly, like pyrite color coming through that's scratched. And we've got our, right, our edges here that are more transparent. Now, in this case, it might make sense to go back in and maybe have a separate vertex map on the same object that we would use to make harder edges for, like, say, paint. If this was, if you were imagining this was like paint that's flaking off or whatever, we might be able to do something like that. Or it might be something where maybe we actually have this blended with the scratches or something like that a little bit, so that we get edges that look a little bit better than they do now. Right, I'm not going to go too deep into that right now, but that is one option, is to change it so that that color would be more crisp on those edges. But I'm just showing you how you can interconnect all these things together, and I don't want this to be too long or too in-depth. So there's one last thing I want to go over with vertex maps, and that's the use fields section. So what I'm going to do is I am going to continue working with this primary cube. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see the whole thing in the view. And you can kind of see how this, ooh, that is ugly. Let's go ahead and change that yellow color that's just like sickly, kind of greenish. Let's make it a little bit warmer and more like a gold or bronze or something like that. And maybe I could even go a little bit warmer on this and be happy with it. Okay, so let's see if that is less obnoxious. And then maybe not red paint. Maybe we'll do teal or something nice. Look at that. Let's see how this looks. Oh, beautiful. Oh man, that's ugly. So we could, yeah, there's ways that we could continue to clean this up, but we're going to keep it ugly as it stands. Okay, so let's go ahead and select our vertex map. And currently I'm just going to go ahead and close my material manager or my editor. I'm going to go to standard mode. I don't need to see the render view, because I really just want to be able to see this as well as possible. So I'm going to select this tag. I'm going to check mark use fields. Now, because I have already painted this on here, the use fields is going to preserve whatever was done to the vertex map, but then it's going to allow me to use fields to make more changes to this. So now if I go to the Fields tab, right, I can use all sorts of different fields. And note that there's this freeze field that's already put in here. And what that does is it's basically locking this in place. It's freezing it. And so now there's lots of other fields I could use, right? If I just needed something to change over time, right, or not over, well, I mean, I guess you could technically actually use vertex maps and fields to have material that would change, that you could animate over time. But let's say I just want to do a linear field, right? We're going to start there. So I apply a linear field, and you'll see that my linear field is essentially adding to whatever's there, right? So I'm getting this nice slow fade across this surface, but it's going to be, one face is going to be super bright, right? And if I select my linear field in my viewport and say, instead of using the paintbrush tool, was using a selection tool or one of the move tools or whatever, right? I could adjust this, so I could say rotate this field, 90 degrees, so it's going to be like this. I could rotate it this way, so maybe it's hard scratches at the top, maybe they're angled a little bit. I could shrink this down so it's, a harder edge, right? So again, we can use fields to do some interesting things with this. Let's just go ahead and see what that looks like. It's probably weird. I'm going to go ahead and render this again so we can kind of see. Yeah, so you can see right now my scratches are coming in on that bottom side and coming in on the top surface as well. Okay, so other fields that we can use here. If I go ahead and select my cube again, I'm going to pull this over so we can see. I am going to select the vertex tag here. I'm going to uncheck linear field, so it's hidden. And I'm going to click and hold here, and I'm going to just go ahead and do a random field. Now, once I've done that random field, you'll see right now I'm getting a variation of scratches in the surface, a variation of paint on the surface. This actually looks a lot better in terms of wear. It's not perfect, but it is getting better. And with this random field, right, I can increase the scale some. So let's just say make this 400%. And I should be able to also, let's see here. I don't know if you can, oh, maybe under remapping. Yeah, I should be able to boost the minimum strength a little bit here, so it can either be, right, so basically what that's doing, you can kind of see it's bringing more, more of the gold through. If I was to crank this, this maximum down some, we're going to, let's see, right, that'll flatten it out a little bit. It really changes, right, how this noise looks. Right, this gives us pretty much our, this inner offset allows us to have more or less contrast, so you can kind of see how the changes that made. If I invert it, right, I'm going to get lots of areas where there's more blue paint and less and less areas that are poking through. It really depends, right, on your purpose. But there's, right, I can use this noise field, right? There's all the different fields are totally usable. And so, there's sound as well, right? If you have a sound file and you're doing animation, you can have a material that reacts to sound. In terms of how it's applied. It's kind of awesome. So yeah, so this is how to use vertex maps to create variable and very highly controllable and manipulatable materials using Redshift.